Good morning. We are coming on the air right now because President Trump has just arrived at the United Nations for his first speech to the UN General Assembly. That is the scene in the hall right there where the president will appear in just a few minutes. He just arrived at Trump Tower. Expecting some tough talk today on Iran and North Korea. I'm here with our chief White House correspondent, Jonathan Karl. And John, here comes the president. So let's watch him walk in. And as we do this, one thing he's going to be seeing there right in the front row, the North Korean delegate.
Right, because of the way the seating chart works out today, they will be front and center representatives of the North Korean government. And the indication that I have heard from top White House officials is this will be a very tough message on North Korea, urging the world to isolate North Korea and reminding them that there is a military option if diplomacy fails.
This comes after the latest UN sanctions passed last week. The president trying to galvanize the world will speak on Iran's nuclear program as well. He's threatened to pull out of that agreement. Let's listen to the president.
Mr. Secretary General, Mr. President, world leaders, and distinguished delegates, welcome to New York. It is a profound honor to stand here in my home city as a representative of the American people to address the people of the world. As millions of our citizens continue to suffer the effects of the devastating hurricanes that have struck our country, I want to begin by expressing my appreciation to every leader in this room who has offered assistance and aid. The American people are strong and resilient, and they will emerge from these hardships more determined than ever before. Fortunately, the United States has done very well since Election Day last November 8th. The stock market is at an all-time high, a record. Unemployment is at its lowest level in 16 years, and because of our regulatory and other reforms, we have more people working in the United States today than ever before. Companies are moving back, creating job growth the likes of which our country has not seen in a very long time. And it has just been announced that we will be spending almost $700 billion on our military and defense. Our military will soon be the strongest it has ever been. For more than 70 years, in times of war and peace, the leaders of nations, movements, and religions have stood before this assembly. Like them, I intend to address some of the very serious threats before us today, but also the enormous potential waiting to be unleashed. We live in a time of extraordinary opportunity. Breakthroughs in science, technology, and medicine are curing illnesses and solving problems that prior generations thought impossible to solve. But each day also brings news of growing dangers that threaten everything we cherish and value. Terrorists and extremists have gathered strength and spread to every region of the planet. Rogue regimes represented in this body not only support terrorists, but threaten other nations and their own people with the most destructive weapons known to humanity. Authority and authoritarian powers seek to collapse the values, the systems, and alliances that prevented conflict and tilted the world toward freedom since World War II. International criminal networks traffic drugs, weapons, people, force dislocation and mass migration, threaten our borders, and new forms of aggression exploit technology to menace our citizens. To put it simply, we meet at a time of both immense promise and great peril. It is entirely up to us whether we lift the world to new heights or let it fall into a valley of disrepair. We have it in our power, should we so choose, to lift millions from poverty, to help our citizens realize their dreams, and to ensure that new generations of children are raised free from violence, hatred, and fear. This institution was founded in the aftermath of 2 world wars to help shape this better future. It was based on the vision that diverse nations could cooperate to protect their sovereignty, preserve their security, and promote their prosperity. It was in the same period, exactly 70 years ago, that the United States developed the Marshall Plan to help restore Europe. Those 3 beautiful pillars, they're pillars of peace, sovereignty, security, and prosperity. The Marshall Plan was built on the noble idea that the whole world is safer when nations are strong, independent, and free. As President Truman said in his message to Congress at that time, our support of European recovery is in full accord with our support of the United Nations. The success of the United Nations depends upon the independent strength of its members. To overcome the perils of the present and to achieve the promise of the future, we must begin with the wisdom of the past. Our success depends on a coalition of strong and independent nations that embrace their sovereignty to promote security, prosperity, and peace for themselves and for the world. We do not expect diverse countries to share the same cultures, traditions, or even systems of government, but we do expect all nations to uphold these 2 core sovereign duties: to respect the interests of their own people and the rights of every other sovereign nation. This is the beautiful vision of this institution, and this is the foundation for cooperation and success. Strong sovereign nations let diverse countries with different values, different cultures, and different dreams not just coexist, but work side by side on the basis of mutual respect. Strong sovereign nations let their people take ownership of the future and control their own destiny. And strong sovereign nations allow individuals to flourish in the fullness of the life intended by God. In America, we do not seek to impose our way of life on anyone, but rather to let it shine as an example for everyone to watch. This week gives our country a special reason to take pride in that example. We are celebrating the 230th anniversary of our beloved Constitution, the oldest Constitution still in use in the world today. This timeless document has been the foundation of peace, prosperity, and freedom for the Americans and for countless millions around the globe whose own countries have found inspiration in its respect for human nature, human dignity, and the rule of law. The greatest in the United States Constitution is its first 3 beautiful words. They are, "We the people." Generations of Americans have sacrificed to maintain the promise of those words, the promise of our country and of our great history. In America, the people govern, the people rule, and the people are sovereign. I was elected not to take power, but to give power to the American people where it belongs. In foreign affairs, we are renewing this founding principle of sovereignty. Our government's first duty is to its people, to our citizens, to serve their needs, to ensure their safety, to preserve their rights, and to defend their values. As President of the United States, I will always put America first. just like you, as the leaders of your countries, will always and should always put your countries first. All responsible leaders have an obligation to serve their own citizens, and the nation-state remains the best vehicle for elevating the human condition. But making a better life for our people also requires us to work together in close harmony and unity to create a more safe and peaceful future for all people. The United States will forever be a great friend to the world, and especially to its allies. But we can no longer be taken advantage of or enter into a one-sided deal where the United States gets nothing in return. As long as I hold this office, I will defend America's interests above all else. But in fulfilling our obligations to our own nations, we also realize that it's in everyone's interest to seek a future where all nations can be sovereign, prosperous, and secure. America does more than speak for the values expressed in the United Nations Charter. Our citizens have paid the ultimate price to defend our freedom and the freedom of many nations represented in this great hall. America's devotion is measured on the battlefields where our young men and women have fought and sacrificed alongside of our allies. From the beaches of Europe to the deserts of the Middle East to the jungles of Asia. It is an eternal credit to the American character that even after we and our allies emerged victorious from the bloodiest war in history, we did not seek territorial expansion or attempt to oppose and impose our way of life on others. Instead, we helped build institutions such as this one to defend the sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. For the diverse nations of the world, this is our hope. We want harmony and friendship, not conflict and strife. We are guided by outcomes, not ideology. We have a policy of principled realism rooted in shared goals, interests, and values. That realism forces us to confront a question facing every leader and nation in this room. It is a question we cannot escape or avoid. We will slide down the path of complacency, numb to the challenges, threats, and even wars that we face. Or do we have enough strength and pride to confront those dangers today so that our citizens can enjoy peace and prosperity tomorrow? If we desire to lift up our citizens, if we aspire to the approval of history, then we must fulfill our sovereign duties to the people we faithfully represent. We must protect our nations, their interests, and their futures. We must reject threats to sovereignty from the Ukraine to the South China Sea. We must uphold respect for law, respect for borders, and respect for culture, and the peaceful engagement these allow. And just as the founders of this body intended, we must work together and confront together those who threaten us with chaos, turmoil, and terror. The scourge of our planet today is a small group of rogue regimes that violate every principle on which the United Nations is based. They respect neither their own citizens nor the sovereign rights of their countries. If the righteous many do not confront the wicked few, then evil will triumph. When decent people and nations become bystanders to history, the forces of destruction only gather power and strength. No one has shown more contempt for other nations and for the well-being of their own people than the depraved regime in North Korea. It is responsible for the starvation deaths of millions of North Koreans and for the imprisonment, torture, killing, and oppression of countless more. We were all witness to the regime's deadly abuse when an innocent American college student, Otto Warmbier, was returned to America only to die a few days later. We saw it in the assassination of the dictator's brother using banned nerve agents in an international airport. We know it kidnapped a sweet 13-year-old Japanese girl from a beach in her own country to enslave her as a language tutor for North Korea's spies. If this is not twisted enough, now North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles threatens the entire world with unthinkable loss of human life. It is an outrage that some nations would not only trade with such a regime, but would arm, supply, and financially support a country that imperils the world with nuclear conflict. No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing, and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about. That's what the United Nations is for. Let's see how they do. It is time for North Korea to realize that the denuclearization is its only acceptable future. The United Nations Security Council recently held 2 unanimous 15-0 votes adopting hard-hitting resolutions against North Korea, and I want to thank China and Russia for joining the vote to impose sanctions along with all of the other members of the Security Council. Thank you to all involved. But we must do much more. It is time for all nations to work together to isolate the Kim regime until it ceases its hostile behavior. We face this decision not only in North Korea. It is far past time for the nations of the world to confront another reckless regime, one that speaks openly of mass murder, vowing death to America, destruction to Israel, and ruin for many leaders and nations in this room. The Iranian government masks a corrupt dictatorship behind the false guise of a democracy. It has turned a wealthy country with a rich history and culture into an economically depleted rogue state whose chief exports are violence, bloodshed, and chaos. The longest suffering victims of Iran's leaders are, in fact, its own people. Rather than use its resources to improve Iranian lives, its oil profits go to fund Hezbollah and other terrorists that kill innocent Muslims and attack their peaceful Arab and Israeli neighbors. This wealth, which rightly belongs to Iran's people, also goes to shore up Bashar al-Assad's dictatorship, fuel Yemen's civil war, and undermine peace throughout the entire Middle East. We cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program. The Iran deal was one of the worst and most one-sided transactions the United States has ever entered into. Frankly, that deal is an embarrassment to the United States, and I don't think you've heard the last of it, believe me. It is time for the entire world to join us in demanding that Iran's government end its pursuit of death and destruction. It is time for the regime to free all Americans and citizens of other nations that they have unjustly detained. And above all, Iran's government must stop supporting terrorists, begin serving its own people, and respect the sovereign rights of its neighbors. The entire world understands that the good people of Iran want change. And other than the vast military power of the United States, that Iran's people are what their leaders fear the most. This is what causes the regime to restrict internet access, tear down satellite dishes, shoot unarmed student protesters, and imprison political reformers. Oppressive regimes cannot endure forever, and the day will come when the people will face a choice. Will they continue down the path of poverty, bloodshed, and terror, or will the Iranian people return to the nation's proud roots as a center of civilization, culture, and wealth, where their people can be happy and prosperous once again? The Iranian regime's support for terror is in stark contrast to the recent commitments of many of its neighbors to fight terrorism and halt its financing. In Saudi Arabia early last year, I was greatly honored to address the leaders of more than 50 Arab and Muslim nations. We agreed that all responsible nations must work together to confront terrorists and the Islamic extremism that inspires them. We will stop radical Islamic terrorism because we cannot allow it to tear up our nation and indeed to tear up the entire world. We must deny the terrorists safe haven, transit, funding, and any form of support for their vile and sinister ideology. We must drive them out of our nations. It is time to expose and hold responsible those countries who support and finance terror groups like Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, the Taliban, and others that slaughter innocent people. The United States and our allies are working together throughout the Middle East to crush the loser terrorists and stop the reemergence of safe havens they use to launch attacks on all of our people. Last month, I announced a new strategy for victory in the fight against this evil in Afghanistan. From now on, our security interests will dictate the length and scope of military operations, not arbitrary benchmarks and timetables set up by politicians. I have also totally changed the rules of engagement in our fight against the Taliban and other terrorist groups. In Syria and Iraq, we have made big gains toward lasting defeat of ISIS. In fact, our country has achieved more against ISIS in the last 8 months than it has in many, many years combined. We seek the de-escalation of the Syrian conflict and a political solution that honors the will of the Syrian people. The actions of the criminal regime of Bashar al-Assad, including the use of chemical weapons against his own citizens, even innocent children, shock the conscience of every decent person. No society could be safe if banned chemical weapons are allowed to spread. That is why the United States carried out a missile strike on the airbase that launched the attack. We appreciate the efforts of the United Nations agencies that are providing vital humanitarian assistance in areas liberated from ISIS, and we especially thank Jordan, Turkey, and Lebanon for their role in hosting refugees from the Syrian conflict. The United States is a compassionate nation and has spent billions and billions of dollars in helping to support this effort. We seek an approach to refugee resettlement that is designed to help these horribly treated people and which enables their eventual return to their home countries to be part of the rebuilding process. For the cost of resettling one refugee in the United States, we can assist more than 10 in their home region. Out of the goodness of our hearts, we offer financial assistance to hosting countries in the region, and we support recent agreements of the G20 nations that will seek to host refugees as close to their home countries as possible. This is the safe, responsible, and humanitarian approach. For decades, the United States has dealt with migration challenges here in the Western Hemisphere. We have learned that over the long term, uncontrolled migration is deeply unfair to both the sending and the receiving countries. For the sending countries, it reduces domestic pressure to pursue needed political and economic reform and drains them of the human capital necessary to motivate and implement those reforms. For the receiving countries, the substantial costs of uncontrolled migration are borne overwhelmingly by low-income citizens whose concerns are often ignored by both media and government. I want to salute the work of the United Nations in seeking to address the problems that cause people to flee from their homes. The United Nations and African Union led peacekeeping missions to have invaluable contributions in stabilizing conflicts in Africa. The United States continues to lead the world in humanitarian assistance, including famine prevention and relief in South Sudan, Somalia, and northern Nigeria and Yemen. We have invested in better health and opportunity all over the world through programs like PEPFAR, which funds AIDS relief, the President's Malaria Initiative, the Global Health Security Agenda, the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, and the Woman Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, part of our commitment to empowering women all across the globe. We also thank the Secretary General for recognizing that the United Nations must reform if it is to be an effective partner in confronting threats to sovereignty, security, and prosperity. Too often, the focus of this organization has not been on results, but on bureaucracy and process. In some cases, states that seek to subvert this institution's noble aims have hijacked the very systems that are supposed to advance them. For example, it is a massive source of embarrassment to the United Nations that some governments with egregious human rights records sit on the UN Human Rights Council. The United States is one out of 193 countries in the United Nations. and yet we pay 22% of the entire budget and more. In fact, we pay far more than anybody realizes. The United States bears an unfair cost burden, but to be fair, if it could actually accomplish all of its stated goals, especially the goal of peace, this investment would easily be well worth it. Major portions of the world are in conflict, and some, in fact, are going to hell. But the powerful people in this room, under the guidance and auspices of the United Nations, can solve many of these vicious and complex problems. The American people hope that one day soon the United Nations can be a much more accountable and effective advocate for human dignity and freedom around the world. In the meantime, we believe that no nation should have to bear a disproportionate share of the burden, militarily or financially. Nations of the world must take a greater role in promoting secure and prosperous societies in their own regions. That is why in the Western Hemisphere, the United States has stood against the corrupt, destabilizing regime in Cuba and embraced the enduring dream of the Cuban people to live in freedom. My administration recently announced that we will not lift sanctions on the Cuban government until it makes fundamental reforms. We have also imposed tough, calibrated sanctions on the socialist Maduro regime in Venezuela, which has brought a once thriving nation to the brink of total collapse. The socialist dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro has inflicted terrible pain and suffering on the good people of that country. This corrupt regime destroyed a prosperous nation by imposing a failed ideology that has produced poverty and misery everywhere it has been tried. To make matters worse, Maduro has defied his own people, stealing power from their elected representatives to preserve his disastrous rule. The Venezuelan people are starving, and their country is collapsing. Their democratic institutions are being destroyed. This situation is completely unacceptable, and we cannot stand by and watch. As a responsible neighbor and friend, we and all others have a goal. That goal is to help them regain their freedom, recover their country, and restore their democracy. I would like to thank leaders in this room for condemning the regime and providing vital support to the Venezuelan people. The United States has taken important steps to hold the regime accountable. We are prepared to take further action if the government of Venezuela persists on its path to impose authoritarian rule on the Venezuelan people. We are fortunate to have incredibly strong and healthy trade relationships with many of the Latin American countries gathered here today. Our economic bond forms a critical foundation for advancing peace and prosperity for all of our people and all of our neighbors. I ask every country represented here today to be prepared to do more to address this very real crisis. We call for the full restoration of democracy and political freedoms in Venezuela. The problem in Venezuela is not that socialism has been poorly implemented, but that socialism has been faithfully implemented. From the Soviet Union to Cuba to Venezuela, wherever true socialism or communism has been adopted, it has delivered anguish and devastation and failure. Those who preach the tenets of these discredited ideologies only contribute to the continued suffering of the people who live under these cruel systems. America stands with every person living under a brutal regime. Our respect for sovereignty is also a call for action. All people deserve a government that cares for their safety, their interests, and their well-being, including their prosperity. In America, we seek stronger ties of business and trade with all nations of goodwill. But this trade must be fair and it must be reciprocal. For too long, the American people were told that mammoth multinational trade deals, unaccountable international tribunals, and powerful global bureaucracies were the best way to promote their success. But as those promises flowed, millions of jobs vanished and thousands of factories disappeared. Others gamed the system and broke the rules. And our great middle class, once the bedrock of American prosperity, was forgotten and left behind. But they are forgotten no more, and they will never be forgotten again. While America will pursue cooperation and commerce with other nations, we are renewing our commitment to the first duty of every government, the duty of our citizens. This bond is the source of America's strength and that of every responsible nation represented here today. If this organization is to have any hope of successfully confronting the challenges before us, it will depend, as President Truman said some 70 years ago, on the independent strength of its members. If we are to embrace the opportunities of the future and overcome the present dangers together, there can be no substitute for strong, sovereign, and independent nations. Nations that are rooted in their histories and invested in their destinies. Nations that seek allies to befriend, not enemies to conquer. And most important of all, nations that are home to patriots, to men and women who are willing to sacrifice for their countries, their fellow citizens, and for all that is best in the human spirit. In remembering the great victory that led to this body's founding, we must never forget that those heroes who fought against evil also fought for the nations that they loved. Patriotism led the Poles to die to save Poland, the French to fight for a free France, and the Brits to stand strong for Britain. Today, if we do not invest ourselves, our hearts and our minds in our nations, if we will not build strong families, safe communities, and healthy societies for ourselves, no one can do it for us. We cannot wait for someone else, for faraway countries or far-off bureaucracies. We can't do it. We must solve our problems to build our prosperity, to secure our future, or we will build vulnerable to decay, domination, and defeat. The true question for the United Nations today, for people all over the world who hope for better lives for themselves and their children, is a basic one. Are we still patriots? Do we love our nations enough to protect their sovereignty and to take ownership of their futures? Do we revere them enough to defend their interests, preserve their cultures, and ensure a peaceful world for their citizens? One of the greatest American patriots, John Adams, wrote that the American Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. That was the moment when America awoke, when we looked around and understood that we were a nation. We realized who we were, what we valued, and what we would give our lives to defend. From its very first moments, the American story is the story of what is possible when people take ownership of their future. The United States of America has been among the greatest forces for good in the history of the world, and the greatest defenders of sovereignty, security, and prosperity for all. Now we are calling for a great reawakening of nations, for the revival of their spirits, their pride, their people, and their patriotism. History is asking us whether we are up to the task. Our answer will be a renewal of will, a rediscovery of resolve, and a rebirth of devotion we need to defeat the enemies of humanity and unlock the potential of life itself. Our hope is a word and world of proud, independent nations that embrace their duties, seek friendship, respect others, and make common cause in the greatest shared interest of all, a future of dignity and peace for the people of this wonderful earth. This is the true vision of the United Nations, the ancient wish of every people, and the deepest yearning that lives inside every sacred soul. So let this be our mission, and let this be our message to the world. We will fight together, sacrifice together, and stand together for peace, for freedom, for justice, for family, for humanity, and for the Almighty God who made us all. Thank you. God bless you. God bless the nations of the world, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Forceful rhetoric there from President Donald Trump in his first address to the UN General Assembly. Just over 40 minutes there where the president meditated on the theme of strong sovereign nations, saying at a time of immense promise and great peril, he will always put America first as America's president. Strongest words, toughest words for North Korea in this speech. I want to bring in our chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz. He called it a depraved regime. Martha, he said, if the United States is forced to defend ourselves against North Korea will be totally destroyed. He even used his new nickname for Kim Jong-un, Rocket Man.
He sure did, George. These were the strongest words we have seen the president say, and certainly made much stronger because of the setting, because he is speaking in front of the world. These were not off-the-cuff remarks. This was not a tweet. We talked about the fire and fury comments from last month, but this before the world body saying they would totally destroy North Korea is a very sobering message for Kim Jong-un, something he is undoubtedly listening to.
He's listening. The North Korean ambassador had actually walked out of the room by the time the president spoke. The president also said that denuclearization, North Korea getting rid of its nuclear weapons, the only option. I want to bring in our chief foreign correspondent, Terry Moran, in London this morning as well. And Terry, as I said, meditation on this theme of strong sovereign nations, a very unapologetic speech from President Trump.
That's right, George. This is the revenge of the nation state at the United Nations, which was meant to bring nation states together after they'd torn the world apart in World War II under the umbrella of cooperation. And every American president, the United States basically birthed the United Nations. And every American president since then has at least paid lip service to this notion of bringing the nations together under the aegis of the United Nations. This was very different. He said something, frankly, that Vladimir Putin would have said, no question about it, when he said that we do not expect diverse countries to share the same cultures, but we do expect all nations to uphold two core sovereign duties: to respect the interests of their own people and the rights of every other sovereign sovereign nation. And there are lots of dictators around the world, including Vladimir Putin, who say the same thing and will hear those words, however President Trump meant them, as a license to do what they want to their own people.
I think that's true, although there was also some veiled criticism of both Vladimir Putin and China when he talked about preserving sovereignty from Ukraine to the South China Sea. I'm here with our chief White House correspondent as well, Jonathan Karl. Not only tough words for North Korea, also Iran. The president had said during the campaign he wanted to rip up the Iran nuclear agreement, but he's defended it or accepted it to date. This may not be the last word.
Yeah, and he didn't say that he was going to rip it up here, but he did say something extraordinary, George. He called the Iran nuclear deal an embarrassment. He called it an embarrassment. What is fascinating about that is this is an agreement that was negotiated by the previous United States President, Barack Obama, but also with our strongest allies there in that hall. And he said that agreement is an embarrassment. We have not heard the end of it. Unclear whether or not he will ultimately do what he threatened during the campaign and rip it up. But I would say overall, this was in many ways a serious, substantive, often positive speech that included an extraordinary threat. I mean, go back to that North Korea to say to totally destroy North Korea if we are forced to defend ourselves.
Absolute terms right there. I want to bring Martha Raddatz back in as well. One of the problems with this idea of ripping up the Iran nuclear agreement, not only, as John said, the fact that our allies all support it, but also the fact that UN inspectors so far have said that Iran is abiding by that nuclear agreement.
They have, and President Trump has said they are not abiding by the spirit of the agreement. So I think it's exactly as John said. He has till October 15th to decide what he'll do about that agreement. I think certainly the Iranians know they will be watching very, very carefully if they go beyond, as they say, going against the spirit of the agreement. But, George, I want to go back again just quickly to that North Korea statement. People do understand that there is a military option. The United States could destroy North Korea, but not without a great loss of life in South Korea and possibly to U.S. forces as well. This is a very big threat.
And I want to follow that up with Terry Moran as well, because, Terry, if you read the president's words, he said the conditions for totally destroying North Korea would be a force to defend ourselves and our allies. You could read that possibly to even open up a justification for preventive war against North Korea.
That is a potential justification, but the words totally destroying a nation of 25 million people, that borders on the threat of committing a war crime.
And that is going to be the last word for us right now. Extraordinary speech from President Donald Trump at the United Nations General Assembly today, his first speech to the UN General Assembly. We're going to return now to our regular programming. For many of you on the West Coast, that is GMA. You can get the latest breaking news anytime by downloading our ABC News app. You can also sign up for breaking news alerts. Of course, get a full report tonight on World News Tonight with David Muir. Have a good day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hi everyone, Amna Nawaz here, continuing coverage of President Trump's first speech before the United Nations General Assembly. You just saw his remarks there, a little over 40 minutes, in which he tried to take some of the campaign promises he ran on, including America First, and translate them into foreign policy for the rest of the world. Let's go live now to ABC's political director, Rick Klein. He was keeping an eye on the speech from down there in Washington, D.C. And Rick, a couple of phrases that stood out to me that the president used over and over again. He talked about the independence of nations. He talked about strong sovereign nations. The messaging was sort of like, we're going to do us, you guys do you, maybe we'll come together and do some deals.
But I think that was only the first half of the speech, because the second half was about potentially obliterating North Korea, about not tolerating Iran, violating a nuclear agreement, about potential interventionism in Venezuela and in Syria. And in Venezuela's case, it was about specifically the form of government. So I think that this highlights the inherent disconnect of President Trump. He is not an isolationist, and in some ways you could tick through the way that he rattled off threats and said this would be a traditional Republican foreign policy speech. But it had all those Trumpian touches. To call the leader of North Korea a rocket man, to say that there's parts of the world that are going to hell, to call out Venezuela as he did in those explicit terms. I feel like he was trying to relate to the world the same way that he related to the American people, with the campaign words and the tart phrases that marked the signature of Trump as a candidate.
Let's go to ABC's chief global affairs anchor, Martha Raddatz, who was also keeping an eye on that speech. And Martha, as Rick mentioned, one of the headlines from this speech, of course, we've come a long way from fire and fury. This was a ramping up of tensions. This was a clear threat to what the U.S. could potentially do when it comes to North Korea.
It sure was. And the fire and fury alarmed everyone when President Trump said that. And that seemed most likely an off-the-cuff statement. And several others kind of dialed that statement back. And even Secretary Mattis just a couple of weeks ago said we are not looking to the total annihilation of a country, namely North Korea, even though we have the options to do so. So the president saying we could totally destroy North Korea is an incredibly sobering statement. If you look at how we would do that, and we certainly could do that, but how you would do that and the loss of life involved in that, a country with 25 million people, and of course in South Korea, 10 million people alone. In the capital of Seoul, certainly there would be mass casualties, and there would be casualties among the U.S. military as well, because if you totally annihilate another country, that takes a great deal of military might. The military is taking all of this incredibly seriously. We've seen these exercises. We've seen live fire exercises. We've seen computer exercises on exactly what an attack would look like and what a counterattack would look like. And it is an ugly, ugly picture. It's why a lot of people say there is no military option. What they really mean is there is no military option that does not involve a great loss of life.
You know, Martha, they say again and again that this president doesn't draw red lines. It seems difficult to see how he would back away from the statements that were made in today's remarks.
Well, the one thing I would say, Amna, is that there is a little wiggle room. What exactly does he mean about defending our allies, defending ourselves? Certainly, if they launch a nuclear-tipped missile towards the United States and they see it coming, we will defend ourselves. But before, we said we will defend ourselves. So we don't know at what point you cross that red line. Now, I should add that Secretary Mattis did say they are looking at military options that would not involve loss of life in South Korea, whether that involves a cyber attack or some other sort of attack we don't know about that would disable Kim Jong-un's ability to retaliate. But I cannot imagine what that is. And again, the President of the United States just told the world that if we need to defend ourselves or our allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea.
Grave consequences behind those words. Martha Raddatz in Washington. Thanks for being with us, Martha. Over to Terry Moran in London, who was watching President Trump's remarks from there. Terry, it struck me the president chose to open with a statement about how strong the U.S. military was going to be. And as Rick mentioned, also made sort of some Trumpian statements along the way, talking about the cost-benefit analysis of the U.S. investment in this diplomatic body. What did you make overall of how he presented America on the world stage today?
Well, there's no question, this was an adult portion of Donald Trump. The Americans got used to it during the campaign. This is really the world's first long listen to Trump on full blast. And as you say, he began, as Donald Trump is wont to, boasting about the progress of the United States. He says under his leadership, some of that economic good news probably is momentum, but some of it is also perhaps good feelings about his leadership. And then also the might of the United States. I think the picture he presents to the world of America is of a changed country, a country that no longer is the main sponsorship of internationalism. Every president since Franklin Roosevelt, at one degree or another, was a sponsor of free trade, of multinational and international institutions to resolve conflicts, of defending human rights and other values around the world. This is a totally different American president, and he marked with this speech the end of an American era.
Terry, it strikes me if we're trying to draw some kind of firm infrastructure around what this foreign policy looks like now, some of his harshest criticism was aimed at North Korea and at Iran, both nuclear powers to some degree. And if you're looking for any kind of guidelines as to, how Mr. Trump and the administration view the world, is that where the red lines are? Because really, by all accounts, sort of the moral leadership on every other nation, when you talk about human rights abuses or others, that was sort of abdicated. That was set to to the side. But when in terms of an America First policy, those are the two nations he's choosing to hone in on.
That's right, and Venezuela to a lesser extent. And it's national interest, as he has promised throughout his campaign and from his inaugural address on. His speech in Poland in July was critical in this regard to understand how Donald Trump approaches the world. The national interest, America comes first. And he sees, as do many, the nuclear threat from North Korea as a dire threat to the United States. And he answered it with those truly shocking terms that the United States is threatening to totally destroy a nation of 25 million people, not take out its regime, not cripple its ability to threaten its neighbors or the world, but to totally destroy the nation. The definition of a nation is the people inside a country. He is essentially threatening a war crime, and it is a shock to hear a president of the United States do that.
We'll see how those remarks are playing out in just a moment as well. Terry Moran, live in London. Thanks for being with us, Terry. For those of you who missed those remarks, here is the moment that is resonating most widely after President Trump's first address to the United Nations General Assembly. This is him speaking just moments ago about North Korea and its leader. Take a listen.
No nation on earth has an interest in seeing this band of criminals arm itself with nuclear weapons and missiles. The United States has great strength and patience, but if it is forced to defend itself or its allies, we will have no choice but to totally destroy North Korea. Rocket Man is on a suicide mission for himself and for his regime. The United States is ready, willing and able, but hopefully this will not be necessary. That's what the United Nations is all about.
What you were hearing there was some of the translation that accompanied the president's remarks. But let's bring in my colleague Molly Hunter over in London, who was watching President Trump's address from there. Molly, Rocket Man is on a suicide mission. It's classic Trumpian phrasing. But how are people across the rest of the world reacting to what he just had to say?
Everyone heard him, Amna. Now, Rocket Man is definitely the biggest social moment, I think, so far of what we're seeing. We're still putting together all those stats, but ricocheting around Twitter, around all the social media platforms immediately. Everyone was talking about it. But everyone was talking about the way he described North Korea as well. Depraved, twisted. Those words really carried a lot of weight, and people were talking about that immediately. Amna, I do also want to say, in addition to the North Korea moments, it was interesting. We were watching how the rest of the world was watching the speech. And I actually, from a journalist friend in Iran, he said Iranian state TV was actually showing Trump's speech. We were monitoring various Twitter feeds as well, monitoring both Iranian state TV Twitter feeds. Nothing from those feeds yet, but actually we did check out one of the unofficial DPRK news service, one of the unofficial news feeds of North Korea. And the only tweet that they have tweeted in the last 45 minutes is that the weather in Pyongyang is expected to be 23 degrees and sunny. So nothing specific about that speech.
Molly Hunter live there in London, keeping an eye on how the rest of the world is reacting to President Trump's remarks. Thanks, Molly. Let's bring in now Joe Cirincione down in Washington, D.C. He's the president of the Plowshares Fund and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Joe, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
So we spoke yesterday. Last night you mentioned you were actually meeting with Iranian President Rouhani and members of his administration here. What were they expecting from President Trump's speech, and how do you think they heard what he had to say?
Well, I was up at the United Nations last night, and I had dinner with President Rouhani, about 25 Americans, plus members of his cabinet and chief of staff. They were expecting a very hardline speech from the United States. They were expecting the president to denounce the Iran agreement, as they did. And they said if the president does this, if the U.S. pulls out of the Iranian agreement, they will be pulling out alone, that this will be a threat to diplomacy in the region and diplomacy in the world, and I think that's pretty much what you heard. And the Iranians, of course, have have their own self-serving reasons for criticizing the president of the United States. But I think their view is shared by more countries than probably share the president's view. I don't think there are many people in that room who agree with him that this is a one-sided deal. Remember, this was negotiated with our closest European allies, with Russia, with China. The UN Security Council endorsed it unanimously. This is a globally accepted agreement, and the president is trashing it the way he did on the campaign trail, ominously threatening to pull out of it. If he does, it will, in fact, undermine global diplomacy.
Well, Rick Klein, give me your take on this for a second, because the Iran deal presents a sort of unique problem for President Trump. He certainly ran on it. He was going to rip it up as soon as he got into office. He hasn't yet. And you just heard Joe talk about how it could just create more problems for the president. Is this a problem, and a manufactured problem, that he doesn't want to bring on himself right now?
I think the venting that you heard about the Iran deal, about how unfair it was to the United States, that's unlikely to get a good hearing at the United Nations. And of course, it is a different issue. And even the way the president framed it today casts it in a different issue. And I think just more broadly, the way that the president has had to respond to the realities of the world versus what he said as a campaigner, they have brought out some stark divides inside President Trump's own head, quite frankly. And I think he is trying to figure those things out. And again, I said earlier about the two different speeches that we heard today, one with the kind of soaring idealism of every country having its own sovereignty, the other one with a whole mess of lines. If they weren't read, they were something close to that. I feel like that's where it gets difficult, and I think the Iran deal is a perfect example of that. He's got voices inside his own cabinet, maybe inside his own head, who are saying, get rid of this deal. He has others who are saying, wait a second, let's look at the broader picture here and what it means to establish an Iran that isn't a nuclear threat versus what you have in North Korea now. It becomes very difficult very fast.
Well, here's how some of those voices are coming together and what the president has to say about Iran. For those of you who missed it, this is what the president said about his approach to Iran in remarks earlier just a moment ago. Take a listen.
We cannot let a murderous regime continue these destabilizing activities while building dangerous missiles, and we cannot abide by an agreement if it provides cover for the eventual construction of a nuclear program.
Joe Cirincione, let me get your take on this now. A murderous regime, he refers to the Iranian leadership there. How does the conversation move forward from here? Are we just left in a place of uncertainty now because he ran on ripping up the deal? As you said, the rest of the world probably won't be happy if the U.S. pulls out. Where do we move forward on that now?
You know, this is a very effective speech for President Trump's base, who I think was the primary audience for this. He wasn't talking to the diplomats in that auditorium. These were props, really, for a domestic America First speech. This is what he ran on. This is what it looks like, where it's all about us. It's all about our strength. It's all about our threats to other countries. But here he runs into this problem of core diplomacy. You know, yes, Iran's regime is a murderous regime. Yes, they have one of the worst human rights records in the world. Well, guess what? We make deals with countries like that all the time, with Mao's China, with Stalin's Russia, much more murderous regimes. That's who you negotiate deals with in order to constrain their activities, reduce their activities. And here you get to this fundamental problem. If the solemn word of the United States in making an agreement can be overturned by the next president because of his individual preferences, that undermines U.S. credibility around the world. That makes it extremely difficult to come to an agreement with the next country. For example, North Korea. You pull out of the Iran deal, your chance of negotiating a deal with North Korea dropped to close to zero. But even with our allies, trade deals, how can anyone trust the United States if the United States could just flip on a dime depending on who the president of the United States is? That's the fundamental problem that Donald Trump presents to world leaders today.
Molly Hunter, you mentioned that Rocket Man was catching on to some degree. It's obviously a relatively easy phrase for everyone to get their heads around. Were any of the other concepts that President Trump introduced there, the idea of strong sovereign nations, going after Venezuela and Iran, any of those resonating in those conversations too?
Yeah, Amna, we actually have numbers for Rocket Man. The numbers are going up as we're speaking right now. 21,000 tweets right now since he uttered the word, and that will definitely go up. Amna, I just wanted to say, too, the other thing that was really trending almost immediately, 10 minutes into the speech, the hashtag UNGA, UNGA, was the #1 worldwide trend. So people were listening. The other key, one of the key concepts, I would say, themes that people really got onto on social media and on Twitter was the fact that that first half of the speech was really about sovereignty. And then that second half of the speech, before he pivoted back to patriotism, was really about condemning abusive governments. People really were talking about that. And there was a lot of tweets from Venezuela about Venezuela, not from any officials that we've seen. But people were really digging into the kind of greater thematic impressions of this speech as it went. I would say we were watching again as people were watching from other countries. RT, Russia Today, was live tweeting this. But actually, a lot of people, we were looking a little bit at the Israeli papers, at the Middle Eastern papers. Not a lot of chatter from there. But there also wasn't any mention of Israel and Palestine or the peace process. And so people also took note of what wasn't mentioned, Amna.
That's right. I remember there was a good cutaway there of seeing President Netanyahu in the crowd, though, nodding as President Trump was talking about Iran and the threat it poses in the region. And Rick Klein, I want to ask you about another threat that the president honed in on, this phrase that has been so laden with controversy, this radical Islamic terrorism. It had been a much stronger part of the president's remarks in months past. It didn't play as prominently today, though, even though it was mentioned.
Yeah, I think it was a little bit softer in terms of the emphasis, and clearly the president is focused on the issue. But I think when you talk even about how uncomfortable it is for him to be calling out some U.S. allies with questionable human rights abuses, that is a word, just using the word Islamic in that context. We know that President Obama avoided that, as did Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail, and took quite a bit of flack of it. It seems to me like another example where the president is learning that those words mean quite a bit. So maybe that's a reason to soft pedal it just a touch. But again, this was not a president shy in talking about the threats that needed to be confronted. And I think radical terrorism, radical Islamic terrorism is part of that, and a very prominent part of that. He's talking about that Afghanistan strategy, talking about ISIS, talking about how it relates to Syria and Iran. This is all kind of swirling in his head, and I think a key part of how he views his role on the world stage.
And Rick, if we're looking for sort of key themes to pull out again, one phrase that stood out to me, and I'd love to get your take on it, was that the United States moving forward will be guided by outcomes, not ideology. Did that strike you too?
It does, and I think it's a tweak at other presidents, previous presidents, other foreign policy thinkers who have said, well, what are you? Are you a neoconservative? Are you a neorealist? Do you have a doctrine? And I think the president has made clear that his doctrine is making America great. And to my mind, the doctrine for the world is to respect that America is listening to that, and that there's ways to adapt to that. This was a different vision. Terry Moran made reference to this, a different vision for America's role on the world stage, a Trumpian vision, much more aimed at a domestic audience that is behind him and voted for him because he would say these kinds of things. He would go out there and call threats and not back off of the need to make explicit comments aimed at rogue regimes. And I think bringing that mindset to the United Nations has to be startling. And you could hear gasps in the room when he talked about the possibility of obliterating an entire country. That doesn't happen at the UN typically. And I feel like that, when he talks about being driven by individual outcomes, that is a lot of what Trump is. He plays that individual hand of poker, Amna. He's not looking down the road and saying this is the grand strategy of chess.
Molly Hunter is keeping an eye on what's resonating across social media and some of the international reaction. And Molly, Saudi Arabia was something that came up very briefly. It was sort of a sideswipe. I thought President Trump mentioned the Human Rights Council at the UN and some permanent members who have their own issue with human rights abuses. Saudi Arabia, of course, has been on that list, along with China, as falling under that criticism. But what are you noticing?
Didn't name names, that's for sure, Amna. I mean, there should have been some awkward smiles in the audience from U.S. allies that he specifically didn't mention. You're right, he did mention speaking in Saudi earlier this year. He actually said, I spoke in Saudi last year. It may feel like a year. It was only in May, Amna. But I was going to say, when we were talking about Prime Minister Netanyahu kind of nodding along when he was speaking about Iran, the other person nodding along was the Saudi Foreign Minister Jubeir. He and Netanyahu were both reacting very similarly to this tough talk on Iran. And we will actually hear Prime Minister Netanyahu speak later today. Now, as I mentioned earlier, he didn't actually mention Israel and Palestine or any of the kind of peace process during his speech. We will hear that from Netanyahu later. But I do want to just read a really quick tweet from Carl Bildt. He's the co-chair of the European Council on Foreign Relations, kind of relating to what Rick was saying earlier, is that, quote, President Trump, his UNGA speech resurrects a turbocharged version of axis of evil, now down to North Korea and Iran, dangerously simplistic. And he followed up with a quote, egged on by Netanyahu, it seems Trump wants to take the U.S. into a region-wide war with Iran. Europe will suffer. Everyone will lose. But the two people nodding along with that message was certainly Saudi Arabia and Israel.
That's a grim analysis there, Molly Hunter, live in London. Joe Cirincione, let me get your take on this. A turbocharged version of American foreign policy. It strikes me, though, in past UNGA addresses, you walk away thinking, okay, this is how the president sees the world. The axis of evil is one example that obviously stands out. How did President Trump position the U.S. when it comes to working with these other 192 nations in the future?
Very poorly. You remember when George W. Bush delivered his axis of evil phrase, he was speaking in the well of the U.S. Congress. He was speaking to the American public. When George W. Bush went to the UN, like all other previous presidents, they're seeking to unite the international community, to unite around U.S. leadership. There was no uniting in Trump's speech. There was no really reaching out. This was a lecturing, bombast, bravado with some bromides. He did not succeed in bringing other countries around to a vision of U.S. leadership. You heard what Molly just said about the European response. People are afraid that the United States is heading towards wars, plural, in the Middle East and most importantly in North Korea. This threat that he made to destroy North Korea, this is reminiscent of Nikita Khrushchev. We will bury you. This is the kind of bluster you expect from dictators, not from the President of the United States. And remember, for Koreans, the United States already has destroyed North Korea. In the Korean War, we bombed that country flat. Our military leaders were complaining there were no targets left. So when the North Koreans hear this, they take this very seriously. When Kim Jong-un hears that he's been insulted as Rocket Man, what do you think he's going to do? Cower? Be afraid? I would expect more tests, an answer to this speech with more rockets, quite frankly, more missile tests. So you can see this kind of speech, rather than rallying the world or impressing the world, is likely to make the world more fearful, likely to raise tensions, likely to cause North Korea to react in a way that could indeed lead the United States and North Korea to stumble into a war perhaps neither really wants.
And we'll wait to see how those leaders do react. But Molly Hunter is keeping an eye on some of the reaction already coming in. And Molly, what are we hearing so far?
That's right. So reaction's slow. Obviously, everyone was in that, or many of the leaders were, of course, in that speech, and many were abiding by kind of protocol, not tweeting too much. But we did just hear from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who writes he's just tweeting in Hebrew, actually, which is interesting. We always pay attention, of course, what language these leaders are tweeting to. It often says something about their audience. But Prime Minister Netanyahu tweeting, President Trump told the truth about the dangers lurking in the world and urged us to stand up to all the power to ensure the future of mankind. Now, that's slightly a rough translation, but Netanyahu is absolutely cheering, clapping from the stands, as we talked about earlier. It's going to be very similar to what he speaks about later today when he speaks. He's the speaker number 18 of the morning session. President Trump was the second speaker of the morning session. But Amna, we'll hear a lot. Prime Minister Netanyahu wants to be aligned with Trump on this. He wants to say, see, we're speaking the same language. We're bringing the same message to the world about Iran. Listen to this guy. Listen to the President of the United States. I'm saying the same thing. So this is a good indication of what we'll hear in a couple hours.
And, of course, we'll have full coverage of that here as well. Molly Hunter, live in London. Thanks for being with us, Molly. Thanks also to Joe Cirincione and Rick Klein down in Washington, D.C. And thanks to you for watching as well. Head over to abcnews.com at any time for full coverage of today's United Nations General Assembly and analysis of President Trump's first remarks there this morning. Thanks for joining us for now. I'm Amna Nawaz, and I'll see you back here soon.